Good morning, evening, or afternoon to you, dear viewer. Before we get started, just a quick note on this video's format. The footage you're seeing is my single segment any % speedrun of Metroid Prime. This video is the documentation of the run, but it's also my slightly freestyle reflections on finishing the 80% doc, deciding to work on and finish a run for this game, and the practice and work leading up to it. Before we get started, I just want to say from the jump that I really appreciate all the comments I received on the 80% doc. I read each one and really enjoyed hearing people's experience with Metroid Prime, or finding out about all the history and what it meant to them to hear about it for the first time. This video is partially an epilogue to the 80% doc, but it's also about what dipping my toes into speedrunning Prime has been like. I'd love to hear your experiences with Prime or other speedrun games, so please leave a comment below. It really does mean the most. As soon as I launched the 80% doc, there was a tidal wave of unfocused emotion, which is expected at the end of a 3-year effort of anything. I was, of course, profoundly grateful, relieved, excited, a bit sad, and all of it was experienced through the extremely underwhelming before and after moment of simply clicking publish on YouTube after the marathon uploading and encoding session had finished. Tom and I virtually high-fived, and I sent it to a bunch of people I know, and then I went to do the dishes that had been piling up in my sink, both literally and metaphorically. The first real moment of resolution and accomplishment I felt was a few hours after the launch of the documentary. We streamed about half of it with the Metroid Prime community on the Discord channel. Tom hosted the stream, and I watched with Edzin, Justin, Vertigo, Fusion Varia, East, Sam, and Caveberry. Edzin and I chatted for a bit before the video started, and it was so fun hearing from another longtime community member and how excited he was to see the video. Other than being repeatedly told by Tom how much it meant to him, it was my first realization that this was a significant moment for a ton of people in the community, and it was humbling and gratifying for me as a filmmaker. Watching a documentary film with the people that are involved in the story is one of the most nerve-wracking and wonderful things that I get to experience as a filmmaker. In my opinion, representing people's stories accurately, appropriately, and in a compelling manner is a tricky task and a serious responsibility. And for me, the responses that I've received from longtime Metroid Prime community members, the runners in the video, and all those that have loved the game deeply are by far the most gratifying that I've received. I've thought long and hard about what I wanted to add to such a video, if anything. I thought that maybe I would just let this be my one YouTube video and call it a day. I'm making this video that you're watching right now not because I feel like I have more to say about Metroid Prime's history, for now at least, but as a bit of an open letter and a long thank you note to the Metroid Prime community, and a few mostly unstructured thoughts. In one way, actually learning a speedrun route and going for my own record seemed like a fitting sequel and a venue to share some epilogue type thoughts about the game and this project. I've never been a speedrunner. I've never aspired to a world record or really sought to play games at a noteworthy level. Video games take up a far narrower band of time in my life than they used to when I was young, and for the most part, I'm content to let the time I do spend with them be casual and relaxing. Years ago, I took up and dropped Counter-Strike when playing competitive got to the point where I was using recoil trainers to try and improve my aim and practicing grenade strats on different maps. I've never felt much of a push to turn something that I otherwise find relaxing into something that I want to practice and improve on a continual basis just for its own sake. Still, as I finished up the 80% video, I got the thought that it would be fun to give it a try. It being speedrunning, of course. Not trying to vie for a record position, which I have no hope of apart for hours and hours of practice, more than I could squeeze into my life as it is. Not trying to become a student of the game to the point that I could reach the fabled 21%, but simply to notch any reasonable time. I finished one full casual playthrough of the game for the doc, and I was playing around with some of the speed tricks in order to get a cursory feel for how hard they were. I recorded a lot of footage of individual rooms and stretches of specific gameplay. However, I realized that trying to string together a proper single segment run would probably be the most attainable and straightforward, yet still challenging goal in order to send off the 80% project with one last fun little contribution, and to notch my name somewhere far down the list of people with the patience to run this aggravating and wonderful game. Also, content. One thing of note before I jump into this, I decided to do all of this without talking to Tom about it. I wanted to surprise him with a finished single segment run, but I also wanted to see what I could do on my own. I quickly realized that on your own is not a good way of doing speedrunning, and I talked a lot with Vertigo and Fusion Varia about the route and various tricks. I learned a lot with the resources on Metroid 2002 and various random YouTube videos for different tricks. I became more active in the Metroid Prime speedrunning Discord. Even doing offline runs, I realized that it's nigh on impossible to strive for anything of substance in a game without the vast repertoire of knowledge that others have left behind, but also the active encouragement of people who are still running the game. I'll talk more about the community later on, but I wanted to just start by, again, underlining the importance of community. I talked a lot about it in the 80% doc, but experiencing it as alive and well while I was working on this run was an added layer of enjoyment and gratitude that I felt for the Metroid Prime speedrunning community. The first idea I had for a run was to go in completely blind and try to on-site the route from memory. I had practiced a few of the tricks like slope jump to get Life Giver, early ice beam, and of course space jump first. I felt like I had enough visual memory of all the runners and actual memory of the route to try to not just sub 2 hour time, just completely from memory and without any practice. My first attempt was horrible. The play was sloppy but unfocused up through Flagra. After almost dying in this boss fight, I lost the focus part of that equation. I thought I was being quite clever and would go and get the ice beam after Flagra. After dipping into Magmore briefly, I remembered what I was trying to do and then turned around to aim at ice beam. I made it all the way to Furnace before remembering that there was, in fact, a wave beam door, which blocks an inbounds attempt to get ice before wave, which is that's just a very silly mistake to make, and yet here I was wandering through Chozo ruins, just feeling a bit silly. I corrected this, I went to get boost and wave, and then I doubled back into Chozo. I got the jump over Ruin Shrine first try, which for some reason I took the harder route around the right side of the room rather than just doing the simpler jump on the left side of the room. Anyway, and then I proceeded to spend at least 5 minutes trying to get Life Giver, failing repeatedly at the underwater slope jump. I finally got it after some sad and mild panicking, and then I turned to get ice. I got ice, went into Magmore to try to get plasma, failed, and then turned to Phendrana for spider and supers, but I died. In the bottom of Monitor Station, some turrets slapped me around, and then I died. It was a rather demoralizing death. I had just spent about an hour and a half failing miserably at a single segment run, and I only had a few uninteresting stories and uninspiring gameplay footage to show for it. What was even more frustrating was the feeling that I was already flailing my way through the game, far off the mark of anything that could be considered a reasonable time, and then a single turret shot in Monitor Station shut it all down. I realized how profoundly naive my thought of on-sighting a single segment attempt was, and so I determined to put a bit of practice in and actually give the run the respect it deserves. Still, I learned a few things. Number 1, explaining what I was trying to do is very helpful. I was trying to do commentary during my run. My original intent was to let that commentary be this video. I would quip on my mistakes while I was running, chat through some random thoughts that I wanted to dump, fail a charming number of times at several strategies, but overall, churn through the game and get something in the low 2 or slightly sub 2 range. This was a miserable failure. Looking back at this after my finish run, the thought that I could sub 2 with no practice is now even more outrageous to me. Talking and focusing on playing video games is rather difficult. That's the brilliance, I think, of the couch at GDQ. Or, put another way, it's why streamers can and should make money. It's hard to do something well and be entertaining at the same time. So, I realized whatever I did next would probably not include live commentary. However, one aspect was really interesting. I basically learned the Life Giver slope jump as a result of trying to explain what I was doing as I was trying it. The breakthrough moment came when I forced myself to isolate the first jump and really focus on what I was doing to get height before jumping again. That's when I realized the rhythm of pressing into and out of the slope all happened before the second jump, rather than it somehow adding height to the second jump upon B being pressed. I was imagining Samus sort of jumping off the wall when, in reality, somehow the game pushes or kind of sucks Samus up against the wall through the first jump as you move into and then away from the wall. However, as I was trying to do the commentary and kind of explain it while I was figuring it out, it helped me realize what I was trying to do and gain conceptual knowledge of the thing that I was practicing as I was trying to do it. Learning a manual skill is always a weird dance between the conceptual understanding of a thing and the application of that knowledge through repetition and practice into something that can be consistently and intuitively executed. Whereas in sports, we train the macro level movements like swinging a club, kicking a ball, running quickly and precisely, jumping, blocking, etc. It's interesting to me how in speedrunning, runners train very minute movements of the fingers in very uncommon timings and virtual circumstances to achieve the same effect. Somehow, explaining this helped me sort of drive in that muscle memory and figure out what to do in order to gain some level of intuitive knowledge in a situation where there's no tactile feedback. When you're playing sports, it's obviously very clear when something worked or something didn't. However, in a first-person video game like Metroid Prime, it can be kind of hard to develop that touch for when things are going right or things are going wrong. And as I explained it helped me clarify and build some of that muscle memory from the ground up. Which brings me to another thing that I learned. I need to practice a lot. I realized right after this run that practice would be indispensable to getting even a reasonable time. I realized that Metroid Prime essentially demanded a certain level of respect. Certain individual sequence-breaking moves might not be excruciatingly difficult on their own, but putting it all together into something that can be called a speedrun, and not just a fast and focused playthrough of the game, requires practice, focus, and planning. I realized that I wasn't even going to get something that would be worth posting and calling a speedrun unless I wrote down a route, methodically thought about what tricks I needed to actually learn, and set myself to learning and practice. And on the topic of route, there was a question: how naughty will I be? I first planned a route that roughly corresponded to Calfolio's route. Even though I hadn't written anything down, I figured that I would hew somewhat closely to Calfolio's route by virtue of not doing some of the hardest tricks that have become standard in the route, including early wild, various infinite speeds, IBBF, spiderless shafts, etc. Secret world movement was something that I didn't even want to think about learning, and infinite speed seemed like a headache to learn, so I was thinking basically about trying the least naughty route possible. Tom, Fusion Varai, and I got into a conversation, first in person and then in Discord, about what naughty tricks were in Metroid Prime, and the consensus was essentially that infinite speed and secret worlds were the only two really naughty tricks in the game. In other words, everything else felt like a very in-universe and justifiable extension of Samus's character. Things like dashing and finding tiny spots to stand on in order to exploit things within the world felt pretty reasonable for a skilled bounty hunter to do as she traversed a world. So that's what I decided to stick with for this run. The canonically justifiable tricks, we'll call them. Not for any great conceptual reason, but mostly because I didn't want to drive myself crazy spending 6 months trying to learn an IS or Secret World route. Maybe later, but not at first. And I'll put in a little side note here. Justin's double IS Secret World route is actually quite easy. Infinite speed is not hard. I was being a bit silly not to consider it. But again, I wanted to struggle with it a bit for my own sake and try to find out the run for myself, and that's more or less what I did. But if you're doing it for the first time, I do recommend, again, Justin's beginner route. It's great. Yeah, infinite speed is not as hard as it looks. There are a lot of things that are hard as it looks, but infinite speed is not one of them. Anyway, around this time, about a week after the Any% doc released, I began working on another project which I'll be releasing the first installment of soon. A systematic look at every room in Metroid Prime from the standpoint of aesthetic observation, level design, and how the community has approached these rooms at different times and with different strategies. Tom and I had joked about doing a room tier list as the Any% doc was wrapping up, so this was more or less in the same spirit. The more I practiced and studied certain rooms for speedrunning them, the more I got interested in this project of aesthetic critique and observation of all the rooms. After all, everything that people had studied and figured out about Metroid Prime hinges on the actual content and structure of the game world. It's conceivable that somewhere, in some room, if there were just one additional spot to stand, the entire history of speedrunning Metroid Prime might be different. I'll leave this as a mental exercise for the viewer. Where would you place a single piece of standable geometry in order to change the entire history of speedrunning? In all seriousness though, watching speedruns is one thing, but to study footage and tutorials endlessly is only the faintest handshake of an introduction to doing it yourself. To figure things out, you have to boot up the game and actually look at them for your own sake. Get a feel for how the levels actually look and how they're structured, and then learn it on your own. Doing everything inbounds and without the game-cracking trick of infinite speed felt like an appropriate way to begin my speedrunning journey, both because I felt it would be easier to get a run from scratch, but also because I saw it as the simplest extension of just wandering around the levels and admiring everything that Retro had made and everything the community had figured out how to do within the levels. Finally, I learned about the joys of stress focus while running. One major thing I was pleasantly surprised to learn how much I enjoyed was the nerves of single-segment running. A lot of modern games seem to have sanded off some of the edges of difficulty corresponding to how often you're allowed to save and how much progress you'd lose if you reset. In Metroid games, especially growing up, I remember some of the nerves I had trying to remember the last time I saved when I got into a sticky situation and really having to focus to not die. Single-segment running is a return to form of having the nerves of not losing a run to a death halfway through. When I died in Monitoring Station, there was a bummer feeling of finality and the aw shucks, but also feeling like I really wanted to try again, because the challenge was incredibly enjoyable. I know single segment running is often referred to as grinding, but when you're trying to learn a new route or a new game, getting a decent time for the first time is really just a small taste of stepping into something that's uncertain, not sure if you're actually going to be able to achieve it. And the nerves as you get into the later parts of the run and try to hold it all together are kind of nice. I got into a conversation with Fusion Vari about Early Wild specifically, which we'll talk much more about later, and we talked about how this trick was one of the most nerves-inducing tricks for new runners. It was certainly something I experienced in all of my runs. The feeling of jumping out over open air and having a finite amount of time to claw your way back up was just viscerally unsettling as I was starting out. But the run was peppered with other nerves-inducing moments throughout the rest of it. Platforming in Magmore Caverns and not trying to fall into lava, which actually does eat up a lot of your health. Things like fighting the space pirates and Phazon mines, all of these things were challenging and made me focus and slow down and really have a bit of nerves as I was running, which was actually quite enjoyable. The day after my first attempt, which again was in late December, something really cool happened. ZFG streamed the dock and I had the privilege of hanging out in the chat with his community, answering questions, bantering, and being slightly dizzy at the fact that his stream clocked in at almost 1,000 viewers at various points. For a point of comparison, the video at this point was sitting at about 800 views the morning before that stream started. It was really amazing to see a different speedrunning and sequence breaking community engage with the dock and enjoy the info on Metroid Prime. It was gratifying to see so many people latch onto the video, track with the points that I was trying to make, and enjoy the video over its entire duration. Speaking of arduous things to do in a single sitting, it's also probably the first time I sat down and watched the entire thing all at once. When I watched it with Tom and Fusion Vari on my visit to Canada as we were finishing the documentary, it was about an hour shorter than the final video ended up being, so this was a pretty long endurance activity. And if you've watched the whole thing in one sitting, that's pretty remarkable, thank you. After this is when I think I got the algorithm hug from YouTube. Looking at a graph of the views for the documentary, there was a trickle coming in as people in the community watched and shared it around, but ZFG's stream was nearly a straight line up in comparison. That 6-hour window was the steepest part of the graph up to that point and still is 3 weeks later. People that were watching were really helpful in keeping a separate tab with the video open to ensure that I still got views, and many shared, commented, and subscribed to my channel, which is of course helpful and much appreciated. All in all, it was an immensely enjoyable afternoon and some into the evening as well. I just want to thank ZFG again for giving the video a nice little premiere and giving it a bump in popularity as it wandered out of the gate. I kept thinking about stringing together a run for Metroid Prime. I knew there was a lot I was going to have to learn and practice. The first thing I decided to do was sketch out an actual route. I thought it would be enjoyable to do this on my own from scratch, both to tailor the run to the tricks that I already knew, but also as an intellectual exercise of thinking through the barriers and puzzles of the game from a new perspective. I basically decided to repeat Calfulio's route, but at first I tried to modify it to fit the level of knowledge that I already had. I was going to get the Ice Ruins West powered bomb because I thought the Phendrana's Edge one would be too hard. That's about as far into the route as I thought about before I decided to actually boot up the game and look at some things. One metaphor that I didn't really whip out in the any percent video is that Metroid Prime is a lot like rock climbing. Fusion Vari put it so eloquently, it's hard to prove a negative, so you don't know for sure if something isn't possible in the game. Likewise, in rock climbing, you can look at a stretch of rock and think about how something might be possible, but you just need to spend some time fidgeting with things until you get an intuitive feel for something without having to actually look at it. Still though, to learn it in the first place, you do actually have to look at it. The first thing that I realized was that it was actually easier to do some things than I was making it out in my head, specifically than Phendrana's Edge skips. I went and tried a few things on my own, failed, and then I watched Calfulio's run, and suddenly the whole thing just clicked. I wiggled Samus up the room and was able to place her with some reliable consistency at the power bomb, expansion tunnel, and then jumped down to the door to get Spirit. I continued on with other rooms and tricks. I decided to take Oats and Goats' approach to learning the route, focusing on the major tricks and skips and letting some of the other stuff fill itself in along the way. I went to monitoring station and learned the R jump to strength off the mast, and then I practiced it a bunch until I could get it consistently. I went to Phendrana Shorelines and learned the long dash to the wave beam door, which was a lot of fun to practice. Then I turned my attention to Early Wild. Early Wild is a frustrating and desperately necessary trick. As I said in the any percent doc, it not only shaves off the need for a long return to the backside of Chozo Ruins, but also allows super missiles to be skipped. It's also one of the several hurdles that need to be cleared for skipping Spider Ball. I knew if I was going to learn only one high effort trick, it should probably be this one. I also loved what Oat said about learning how to learn and his comparison to music. I've dabbled in music myself, and one technique that always helped me learn new songs is to play them at a slower tempo until I can nail the song and then slowly ratchet it up to full speed. Trying this in Dolphin was extremely helpful for early wild. Prior to this approach, I couldn't even get up to the ledge I had jumped off of because the bomb jumps felt so shoddy and unreliable. Yet at 50% speed, I was able to find a visual cue which at least helped me consistently move upwards. As soon as the second wave from the exploding bomb emanated, it was time for the next bomb. This cue allowed me to reliably approach the ledge, but the unmorph was still evading me. This is where the community resources were so helpful. Now, I'm not trying to make this a tutorial video or explain how to do early wild, since again, I'm not the best person to ask. But if I were to give one piece of advice, it would be to watch a video of someone doing the trick once, load the practice mod, and then try it a bunch on your own without constantly referring back to the video. This allows you to try out some things with your own intuition, work on getting a feel for it yourself. You form mental theories, you think about it, ponder it, and then after you feel like you've hit a wall, you go back and watch the tutorial again, and then hopefully that intuitive knowledge that you built up starts to click and is clarified. I found that this is so helpful in revealing and correcting errors and pushing past hurdles in practice. As the days in 2023 dwindled, I got as much time in with my family as possible, and in the evenings or a bit of downtime in between, I would occasionally grab my GameCube controller and try to get some reps in at early wild, as well as whatever other tricks I felt might add some reliability and speed to my repertoire. The doc continued to do well in the meantime, and one of the most exciting things about the days immediately following the documentary's release was several longtime community members commenting on the video or reaching out to me via other means. This presented some mixed but mostly positive emotions. First of all, I was delighted and honored to be contacted by folks whose screen names I had spent hours staring at as I was writing the script. Talking to people who cared deeply about things and telling their stories is one of my favorite things to do as a filmmaker. The slight pang I felt mixed in with that was the realization that I hadn't tried especially hard to get into contact with a lot of the people in the story. While many people from the forums over 15 years ago aren't necessarily the easiest people in the world to get in touch with, in many instances I didn't even avail myself of the very simple or obvious means to at least attempt to reach out to them, even if I were to assume that the inquiry would go unanswered. In one instance, I realized that this was a really poor assumption because that means of contacting this person was actually the first method they offered. In any case, all I want to say publicly right now is that I'm very thankful to hear from those people, and I'll be reaching out to others. And I want to keep telling the stories of this and other games with whomever might like to share them. I've cared about Metroid Prime because others have cared about it. So the privilege of being able to hear and share those stories is something that I don't take lightly. People can laugh all they want, but I really did feel like 6 hours and 18 minutes was actually a brief overview of what makes Metroid Prime interesting. I don't feel like I left much of importance unsaid, at least as it pertains to the any percent route and the Metroid 2002 community. But what I feel like I could have included far more of was other people's voices. If each run section could have been an interview with the people that actually did the runs in their own voice, that would have been a far better version of the project. So if you're a runner from Metroid Prime hearing this, I'd be glad to chat with you. Please reach out. There's an email address that you can reach out to me somewhere on my YouTube page. I'm sure you know where to find it. Anyway, early wild continued to be what I spent most of my time practicing. Getting this trick for the first time at full speed was a bit unexpected, but I knew what a successful early wild looked like well enough, and so as soon as I saw Samus cresting over that ledge, it was a celebration that I had gotten it even before she had fully landed. Still, I knew that I had to practice it a lot more to make it reliable for a run. I continued practicing as much as I could over several days, and after 4 or 5 days of practicing 20 to 30 minutes at a time, I was able to approach a level of consistency which gave me some confidence to try it in a run. This involved using the practice mod to give myself 1 energy tank and attempting to hit it as many times as possible in a row within the 1 energy tank margin, which I would have as single segment run at the equivalent point. Mechanically, what primarily changed the most was I got more and more comfortable modulating the stick angle of the GameCube controller to either speed up Samus's fall or slow it to the point of being nearly stationary. Staring at the waves of energy emanating from the ball, which I studied at 50% speed, no longer seemed like the best way to reliably hit the trick, but by getting a good intuitive feel for the right stick angle, I realized that I could more effectively anticipate where Samus needed to be in relation to the timing of the bomb that I actually laid down. After getting more and more of a feel for it, I knew that I was getting closer to my next attempt. It still felt like there was a good chance that it would die right after Flagra at least once, but that's part of the rush of speedrunning, no? After more and more attempts of practicing Early Wild, I felt comfortable enough with it to try it in a run. The first run I attempted was unrecorded and I lost it attempting Early Wild. I couldn't nail it and I died on the Oculuses. I initially thought that I needed to be okay with letting some runs be practice and be unrecorded, since recording took up a lot of hard drive space, but feeling that this would be somewhat self-defeating, I decided that I needed to, from then on, record every attempt and set aside enough time to let it go all the way if need be. A third run a few days later, on January 1st, 2024, was recorded, and this time I hit Early Wild first try. My heart was racing after Flagra, and after going down the hallway and tucking into the trick, the moment the morph ball dropped, it felt like just another practice run, even as my heart raced. 20 or so minutes of real time into the run, I laid each bomb down right on time and felt the tension build as Samus wiggled her way back up in that little ball of bird magic. The unmorphed spot looked a little high, but as Samus glided up no problem, my heart galloped and I wandered down the hall. Even after the ghost fight, which I realized I had not practiced for at all, I was still a bit jittery going into Magmore. I hadn't practiced the platforming from the Chozo elevator through Monitoring Station. As I arrived at Monitoring Station, I realized that I had only practiced the climb around the outside of the room a handful of times, enough to give it a try at least once. I failed, and I fell into the lava and ended up with about 60 health. And as I was, stressed out by the blaring low health warnings, I took a slow and mistake-ridden climb the normal way around the outside of the room. Headed towards Phendrana, I felt the relief of the race tank ahead of me, the energy tank on the way into Phendrana Drifts. I thought to myself, well, I haven't failed this tank once as an adult. It's just 3 double bomb jumps in a row. It's fail-proof. I'm gonna get this and just continue on my way. It was not fail-proof. I biffed the first jump, fell into the lava below, and lost my remaining 60 health, and the agonizing death screams of Samus deflated me, just like it did when I was a kid. Okay. Somehow, though, getting past Early Wild felt like the biggest mental hurdle I had to pass. I continued to practice it until I hit it several times in a row with reasonable consistency. It still feels like a trick that I'll have to dust off occasionally and keep sharp until it becomes second nature. However, once I passed the trick for the first time in a run, I felt like I had walked through a door into actually being a speedrunner of the game. I'm not trying to make this into like a gatekeepy definition of who is and isn't a speedrunner, like you aren't if you can't do this trick. But as I practiced and based on the route that I decided to do, this felt like the most significant threshold that I first had to pass. As I literally clawed Samus bomb jump by bomb jump back up onto the ledge, I felt like when I got back up with the trigger for the ghost fight activated, I had literally climbed onto a plane that virtually all other Metroid Prime speedrunners were already standing on. It was categorically a different experience from all the work I had already done in Metroid Prime. This was participating in the act of speedrunning. Even though I lost this run, I realized a few new things about speedrunning Metroid Prime. First of all, everything needs to be practiced. I think that tricks can basically be divided into 4 categories. Category A tricks are tricks that save time with no permanent implications for failure. Category B tricks are speed-focused, time-saving tricks that carry permanent penalty for failure, such as dying or putting Samus into an unrecoverable softlock state. Category C are tricks that are necessary for the structure of the run, not things that don't only save time but actually are required to progress the run forward, but that can be recovered if failed. And Category D tricks are tricks that can end a run permanently and yet are necessary for the structure of the route, things like Early Wild. The route I had chosen, despite being what I felt was a reasonably difficult run, would have several tricks that fell in the Category D zone. I decided to stay out of B category as much as possible, and where speed was concerned, I would content myself with sprinkling in as many A tricks as possible, mostly because they're fun to practice and make each part of the run enjoyable, while also hopefully shaving off a bit of time. Yet, no matter which category a trick is in, everything with a reasonable chance of failure, permanent or otherwise, would need to be practiced. Every room in Metroid Prime is unique, and each trick needs repetition and consistency of practice to develop it and to be able to string it all together reliably in a run. Practice is integral to finishing a speedrun of Metroid Prime. Throughout my 3 weeks of working on my first any % single segment time, I found the practice to be relaxing and enjoyable for its own sake, and I think that if you can find the same enjoyment in repetitive practice, Metroid Prime will be an enjoyable game for you too. This is the meaning of the title, Metroid Prime is easy to speedrun, because each room is unique and each have their own shade on a similar core set of skills. Every time you load up a room or segment to practice, you're faced with a unique challenge and many different ways of approaching it, and I think that's pretty enjoyable. However, I learned that I would also need to be a bit more systematic with my practice. I took my run order and also listed out all the tricks that slotted into the space between the items. Using my category system above, I ranked the tricks in order of difficulty and I triaged what I would need to practice the most. Much like when I was editing the history video, I decided to break it down into something like a spreadsheet and systematize my practice so that I could identify what needed the most practice. I picked up the stuff that was giving me the most trouble and aimed for practice and repetition up to the point that I could reasonably expect to get it each time without too much trouble. I used Dolphin and Practice Mod to set up save states for each of these tricks, determining the item loadout for that point in the run and then setting myself up at a decent start point, creating a save state, and then moving to another slot in Dolphin's 10 quick access save state spots. If this seems overly fastidious, I'll say that I can't imagine a simpler way of doing it other than throwing random practice at the wall. I realize that items are also crucial because things like phase-on mines, it wouldn't do much good to practice with the phase-on suit in a 100% save state because my energy would be higher, damage would be lower, and I wouldn't be in peril of taking phase-on damage. So actually practicing tricks with the items that I would have for that point in the run order was vital. Finally, it gave me a lot of respect for the old-time runners who only had save stations to work off of. Back then, failing a trick meant resetting your console and rolling back from a save station, which meant around a minute of downtime for the game to load up and whatever time it took you to traverse to the site of a trick the second time. I can't imagine the dedication it took to find some truly temperamental tricks when it took that much work to practice. Finally though, I had one more thought. My first complete run may be my last. I found the practice of practice very cathartic and enjoyable, but I also wondered if I'd have the focus or desire to complete another run once I saw that end screen for the first time. If the run was shot through with mistakes, I might feel compelled to give it another go, but nonetheless, I felt like if I actually got a single segment run completed, that might be good enough for me no matter what the time was. Even after about a week of practice, I realized that the process of doing a single segment run was far more involved than I thought at the beginning, and the thought of trying to add on more complicated tricks or anything that had a high chance of defeating a run made me shudder, but one step at a time. On January 7th, I went for another run. I talked with Fusion Variety a few days earlier on Discord and we tweaked the route to pass through the Pirate Labs in order to move Sun up in the run order and avoid the Thardus Dash, which was eluding me despite an hour of scattershot attempts. This seemed reasonable to me, and as a result, my dashing improved significantly when I learned the proper technique to gain the right height and speed in Observatory. The flick technique of the B button had evaded me, but I saw Justin's great tutorial video and it suddenly clicked. I liked the route well enough, and without any time on the board yet, it was hard to even provide a constructive counterexample to a seasoned player of the game. If Fusion Variety says that the other route is probably faster, then it's probably faster. I had mainly been practicing Metroid Quarantine A leading up to this run. During my first few runs, I didn't even think about how hard this room was going to be. It took me as long to learn as Early Wild, but this trick had the unnerving quality of being much later in the run. It was also premised on having a cooperative Metroid and the time limit of only having 5 attempts to freeze it before it died, and forced a trip back 2 rooms to get a new gang of Metroids to show up. Despite trying the less Metroid-dependent methods of dashing off of the missile expansion and R-jumping, I couldn't even get within sniffing distance of either method. So I worked with the somewhat more reliable Metroid approach. I gave the last Metroid the nickname Frederick the 5th Metroid. It was hard for me to decide when I was ready to try a full attempt. I started to get a bit worried about over-practicing, at least in very short sections of the game, being too reliant on being utterly practiced from a save state start point, to the point that I began to lose the forest for the single save state trees. In my mental map of the run, there began to be spots where there were bright red heat maps of practice, with huge, dark, cold portions in between. This didn't feel right. Not only did I need experience with the meat and potatoes movement through the entire game, but I also needed to experience the nerves of getting later into the run. Nerves were hard to account for, but no matter how far I was into a run, as soon as I started teeing up a trick that was a one-shot attempt or a category D trick, my heart invariably started racing. Of course, I was in no physical danger and I had no speedrunning reputation to maintain. It is a physiological response which rises up only from the desire to avoid rendering all of the run up to that point wasted. My January 7th run felt wasted before I even finally died. I played quite poorly. I fell off of the upper deck in biohazard containment on the frigate. I missed every shot at every instance that it was possible to miss. I bumped into stuff. I took ages to do simple things like the life giver jump. I was playing so badly that I wryly thought that this run was going to be the one that was going to get through to the end, and I was going to have to show this meager performance to the world. My mind wandered in quieter portions of the run to trying again, hoping for a better time. Nothing left to do at that moment but to play on. One of the most embarrassing and frustrating setbacks was getting kicked off of the wall during early wild. It wasn't especially tempting just to rage quit the run at that moment. If nothing else, I could at least practice Magmoor Caverns, which was still giving me trouble. I continued on in the run and pondered my route during cutscenes, thinking about how to fight Thardus and still get a reasonable time. Yet, I died. I cleared the Twin Fires tunnel dash, which had been a major choke point, and trundled on. Then, I died an ignominious death in the next room when I mangled a dash, landed in lava, and forgot which direction the exit of the room was, and I died in panic in the lava. I tried again the next day, but I lost the run one room earlier this time, botching the dash in Twin Fires tunnel and then flailing around in the lava. I was trying to slope jump out of the lava, and in my panicked mind I was thinking of all the times that I popped out easily. But after I died in the lava and then came back in the practice mod, I realized that this was impossible without the gravity suit. And this is why you practice with the items you're going to have at that point in the run. Vertigo was immensely helpful at this point, looking at some of my footage and suggesting a more consistent setup for the dash, which provided more consistent results. I thought about how ridiculous it was that tiny invisible ledges and where you're standing on them can take a difficult trick and make it almost frame perfect if you don't set it up in just the right way. I was looking at others' footage of the same section of the run, and I was doing everything right, standing in the right spot, scanning the right thing. I know how to dash okay. But the game kept eating inputs and I would fall into lava with a very anemic dash, if any dash at all. Vertigo told me that I was making it a bit too hard on myself with a poor setup, coached me briefly, and I was on my way with more fruitful practice. Going forward though, I knew I needed to make at least a few more changes. First of all, I had to actually practice. I was starting to skimp on my methodical practice routine that I had laid out. After nailing certain tricks with relative ease in the practice mod, I thought it would be enough to simply hammer out attempts and correct mistakes with light practice afterwards. Yet, dying several deaths in embarrassing fashion revealed that I was actually going to need to track attempts and success, be methodical about creating save states which tee me up for the hardest tricks, and actually give a bit of gameplay after the trick just so that I might hammer in some durable muscle memory which will see me past the trick itself as I head into later portions of the run. Second, I needed to do a save station run. The idea of using save stations to finish a segmented run was a little bit anathema to me, but having lost about 6 runs at this point, none of which ever even made it to Plasma, it felt important to get deeper into the run, if only to diagnose future weak spots. I decided to go for a run which made use of save stations before every run-ending trick and then only roll back to them when I died. I wanted to practice for later parts in the run, and I wanted to get a gut check of how hard the later bosses would be. Also, I wanted to have at least a general estimate of what my finish time would be given the route. And finally, I decided to delete files. Now, I'm a file hoarder. I rarely delete files, and when I do decide to delete any sizable portion of data, it basically causes me physical pain. Yet, with the lost runs piling up and no intention of really editing or making anything out of them, I decided to delete any lost runs going forward. I was still going to run the recorder with the hope that any given run might be the one. But if the run died, so would that file, and so be it. I was thinking a lot about speedrunning as I worked on this run, what it means, and why it's important. Speedrunning is an activity that doesn't have any meaning apart from the willingness of people to actually do it and watch it. Unlike a mountain or a river or a horse, which all have existence and meaning apart from the observation, reflection, and ritual practices of people, speedrunning is a human cultural activity. It once didn't exist, and if people stop doing it, it will only be a historical footnote. The any % video was a freeform examination into the depth of Metroid Prime, and came about entirely because I had a personal connection with someone who knew more of that depth than almost anyone, Tom. It was 3 years of us geeking out about this thing that we both loved, and it allowed me to stretch my brain for metaphors, analogies, problem solving, and storytelling in a loose and unstructured way as I wanted to do it. Yet, no explainer video will ever penetrate the actual muscle memory and experience of speedrunning the game itself. In the weeks since the video released and I started hammering away at trying to string together a single segment run, I went back and forth on a question. Would the video have been better if I had made some effort to speedrun the game before I started making it? The more convincing side of my brain says no, and that it actually might have been worse. I think I could have probably spent a good 20 minutes alone talking about the experience I gleaned from multiple hours practicing Metroid Quarantine A, hammering the same sequence of moves over and over again to download the muscle memory needed to actually progress the route forward from that point is satisfying. but I think that unless you're looking for advice on how to do it yourself, this isn't an especially interesting narrative piece of the puzzle. I'm sure I missed a lot of the things that runners did that are quite cool because I didn't have first-hand knowledge of how to run the game myself, and I'm sure I oversold the difficulty of certain tricks because of my ignorance of how hard they are or aren't. Yet, the status of being an outsider is a binary switch which really only goes in one direction. Once you have knowledge of these things, it's hard to capture the experience of being an outsider trying to tell other outsiders about something. Once you learn it, you become the person with knowledge trying to convey something. In my case, now almost 3 weeks into attempting seriously to get a time on the boards, I have very limited and imperfect knowledge. And this script up to now has been an attempt to chronicle and distill some of what learning has meant to me, especially after being an outsider for so long. Still, I want to get to the end of this script and the end of one speedrun just to give you some first-hand insight on what that accomplishment means to me. So far, and at this point as I write this, I'm still a long way off from my own time, but very well into the experience of losing run and intensely practicing tricks, I think I have a few general comments to make on the ritual and the practices of speedrunning. First of all, it really is pointless to do this apart from a community of people who love the game. Conversations with Vertigo and Fusion Varia, and sorry Tom, I've really tried to keep this a secret and it hasn't been easy. These conversations have been indispensable to progressing through the game in this manner. Having someone just look over your gameplay or hear a story of a lost run and say, yeah, that's tricky, here's a few pointers, that's all the encouragement I need to keep going. Losing run after run is definitely demoralizing, but having a path of people who have gone before you and have shown you what's possible in the game, and then also the live people still playing it, encouraging you along the way, is just a very necessary nudge to keep going along that path. Second, the game is harder than it looks, but it's easy to love once you get into it. During my interview with Tom and Fusion Varia, there was a bit of an off-camera conversation in which Tom talked about the fact that running the game generally takes a couple years, even of casual play, in order to be familiar with the movement and the world before you really start digging into this movement mechanics. I can't lie outright and say that it's easy to pick up from square one and just give it a rip and you'll enjoy it, but I will say that once you feel comfortable playing it from the beginning to end at a leisurely pace and you're not like failing the basic platforming on a regular basis, it's worth it to try to start to sprinkle in a few tricks just to see how it feels. Maybe try a sequence break here or there, and like once you get Space Jump First for the first time, it's really cool, and I think that's one little gateway drug experience that'll get you into Metroid Prime speedrunning further if that's something that's interesting to you. And finally, in this game, practicing is fun, and unlike almost anything I've ever played, practicing movement in Metroid Prime is uniquely satisfying. Something about the margins of correct execution and the sheer variety not only of rooms, but also of movement technique just really gets your hooks into it once you try it for a while. I said it a million times in the Any Percent video, but there really is unlimited room for improvement of movement, and any given run is so long that there's so much variety and crescendo release of various difficulties, and the thought of just doing another run and giving it another go really is fun and enticing in its own right. Just like the experience of telling the story of the Any Percent history, somehow this game just had enough satisfying depth that it felt like to give up on the effort of putting together a single segment run would be leaving a really satisfying and gratifying experience on the table. In the last days of finishing the Any Percent video, I bought Red Dead Redemption 2 on sale, which I'd never played before, and I used it as a bit of a carrot to get me through the last final tedious weeks of revising and editing and proof checking the video for those last few gremlins of bugs. I thought, I can't wait to be done with this video and give myself a couple weeks off of content editing and just immerse myself in a completely different and really nice video game other than Metroid Prime. Now, I played several hours of Red Dead Redemption 2, but then I started trying to run Metroid Prime again. Now, yes, I did have the ulterior motive of content and creating a follow-up video to the Any Percent doc, but I also just genuinely enjoyed the process of practicing and scheming to get a time in Metroid Prime more than I was enjoying the admittedly really enjoyable and beautiful world of Red Dead Redemption 2. As I worked on the speedrun in the next video to come out shortly, I thought a lot about the content potential of this game and future projects I wanted to work on. I'll say it now, I don't want to just be a Metroid Prime channel or even a video game channel for that matter, but somehow this game just felt like a good place to start. As a professional videographer and video editor, this is far from the first project or even professional project I've worked on. But Metroid Prime, a game I spent countless hours playing and enjoying as a kid, this game is clearly something that still sparks my imagination and creativity to this day. So, at least for now, it seemed like a fruitful place to start as I was trying to find my voice on this new platform of YouTube. After my save station resolution, the desire to finish a run even if I had to use save stations, I set out to finish a run no matter how many save station rollbacks it took. As I got into this run, it felt like this could be the YouTube video, as the more practice and lost runs wore on, the more I just wanted to post something, to do all my voiceover and just be done with it, move on to the next thing. That was another odd aspect of creating this footage, now that I think about it. I was used to creating a lot of gameplay footage for the Any% project, but it always felt like box checking to fill out a shot list. Creating the Any% run was really a performance of the thing itself, namely speedrunning Metroid Prime. Apart from any commentary I was going to put on top of the run was going to be a submission video, a proof video for the speedrun. So the footage was important apart from the visual backdrop of me talking. Now again, I didn't have any pretensions of getting below the 110 threshold needed for video proof, but I can't imagine that more recorded Metroid Prime speedruns are a bad thing. I did have the thought in my head of how out of sync anything that I was going to be talking about was going to be with what I had on screen, and that was bugging me a little bit. I thought about creating a more traditional video essay with all of my old lost runs, showing the relevant sections when I was talking about certain things, but, well, that wasn't the project I was interested in making at this point. Again, I was more so interested in narrating my own experiences of learning the Any% route of Metroid Prime, at least an old one, alongside footage of my long sought after run. And I would weave this in with reflections on finishing the Any% doc, which again is what you're listening to now. So I just let the stress of discordant imagery sit on the side and I kept practicing. Although one thing that I was doing while I was writing the script was keeping an eye on the word count to ensure that I wouldn't run over the length of a potential finished run. Even as I'm recording this voiceover, I'm not quite sure how close it will be to the time of the run, so we're gonna see how that goes. When I got into the later stages of the save station run, I realized I had made a horrible blunder in my routing. My old nemesis, Phase on Mines, that I'm sure you'll remember from the Any% doc, had come back to bite me in a most aggravating way. Part of the reason I went through all the trouble of writing down my route was because I wanted to struggle with it a bit. I wanted to have to hash out the barriers in the rooms and look at a map and ponder it a bit for myself. But I was not quite curious enough because I made a huge oversight in Phase on Mines, which left a very bitter taste in my mouth and a very foolish, I felt pretty silly. The run up to this point hadn't exactly gone well. I had several resets, one during Early Wild, one during the Twin Fires dash, and one after failing the jumps up to the Plasma Beam door multiple times. The Plasma Beam jumps up the Spider Ball tracks was especially giving me a lot of trouble, and I added it to my practice repertoire. I also had the hilariously sad experience of getting to Phase on Mines to the entrance in Magmore without a power bomb, and having to shoot through the rubble for about 5 minutes to get a power bomb drop, which was just, it was pretty sad. Once I was in Phase on Mines though, I was excited. This was my first time in Phase on Mines in the run after all. Things were a bit slow and sloppy like I was expecting, but I got through the maze after fighting the drone for main power bomb and I started moving back out of the mines. I went up elevator A to get to the surface level and a horrible, horrible realization came over me. I realized that the bottom of elevator access A was on the side of elevator A, not ore processing. In my head, spiderless shafts always started from the bottom of ore processing rather than coming out of elevator A. In other words, you come up from sublevel 1, drop down elevator access A, and then climb, research, the other shaft to get into elite research. I was standing there just utterly gobsmacked at the entrance to elevator access A, realizing that to head out the front entrance of Phase on Mines without Spider Ball, I would need to execute spiderless shafts, the infamous trick that took Oats and Goats 5 hours to learn on the spot. In one instant, all my confusion about why the elite wall crawl by Sparky and spiderless shafts was necessary, all of that confusion disappeared. Suddenly, all the routing of Phase on Mines made sense in a single instant. Tail between my legs, I scurried back into Mines as I thought about how to reorient myself on the route. I made my way back to Phase on Processing Center only to realize that, again, I needed the Spider Ball to get out of Phase on Mines. And that's when I realized that I needed to learn the Phase on Processing Center climb in order to get out. Now, I knew what this looked like. I had noticed runners do it in the past, but again, I didn't know how to do this, so. The run was already dead. It wasn't a great run up to that point, but that's when I signed the death certificate on about 2.5 hours of playing Metroid Prime, and I moved on. My save at the end of the maze of getting main power bomb had me at 1 hour 18 minutes, so that felt good, I guess, especially considering how long I struggled with several tricks and how poor my routing was. Instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, I decided that I had struggled enough and it was time to just rip a page out of someone else's run order. I went back to Kip's 104 and Zoidy's 103 route and just copied the run order over into the document I was using to track my own play. These runs were the last non-naughty routes in Metroid Prime before Sparky came through and changed everything, so they at least seemed like the right choice conceptually. I chose to try to come up with a route from scratch for my own reasons, and now I was choosing to actually heed the wisdom of the past for what it was. Wise. I don't think that new runners necessarily need to do this, but somehow having struggled and danced with the game for a bit on my own terms and spent some time learning some tricks that were now going to be eliminated, somehow it made me appreciate the game a bit more. Now look, just so we're completely clear, I didn't think that I was going to invent a faster route than Kip and Zoidy, let alone have the skill to execute it and beat their times. But I wanted to at least try to come up with something novel before copying someone else's work. Once I realized that I was going to need spiderless shafts to make this work, though, it seemed rather pointless to try to keep insisting on this homegrown route. As I pondered the implications of the new route, I realized that I would need to add at least phase-on processing climb and bar skip into my route if I wanted to skip the spider ball. Either that or just get spider ball. I wasn't sure which would be faster, so I had to think about it some more. Bar skip was a weird trick to learn. The first time I attempted it, I hit it within about 2 minutes. But I realized that the community assessment of this trick, that it was inconsistent more than difficult, was definitely accurate. Really, it's only a double bomb jump with slightly adjusted timing and basically inputting the right stick angles at the right times. Yet the slight slope in front of the bars and the camera positioning and getting the right amount of and right direction of speed at the apex was tricky. And it was hard to anticipate when the trick would hit or really practice and position in a right way that would make it consistent. Fortunately, unlike Early Wild, it's an unlimited try trick, so rather than the nerves of losing a run, I just had to endure the frustration of adding more and more time onto a run until I eventually got it. As I practiced bar skip, the attempts would typically run anywhere from 30 seconds to 4 to 5 minutes of attempts. For my own amusement, and because my brain likes it, I decided to log and graph how long each attempt at the bar skip took, because if there was anything to spur me on to practice other than the hope of getting a good time, it was the ability to make a nice graph after it was all said and done. After another lost run to Early Wild, I also decided to add that practice back into my repertoire and log attempts for this as well. Somehow creating a visualization of my passes and fails made it more enjoyable to try again because I was adding another visible data point. I think that this trick is a good microcosm of Metroid Prime speedrunning generally. If you can tuck into practicing this trick and enjoy the repetitive attempts to drill in the muscle memory and the nail-biting seconds as you attempt to execute over open air and the imminent possibility of failure, well, there's a good chance you'll be able to endure what running the rest of the game means. I decided to practice this trick until I was sick of practicing it because I was getting it nearly every time. I read one runner on the Prime Speedrunning Discord speak of it as eventually getting to a 99 out of 100 status, depending on how much you practiced. This was another example of how important the community was. Every time I found a Discord message about Early Wild, there was almost always a runner talking about how it clicks eventually. So it helped me trust that I would get there too. I decided to practice it until I was consistently hitting it 10 times in a row without failing. So I got to work. The longer I worked on this run, the more I thought about what it means to tell stories about speedruns and why people like to speedrun for that matter. Obviously, to learn the route from Metroid Prime and execute a speedrun myself was to engage in the enjoyment of speedrunning for its own sake, not just to tell a story about it. To make a video like this, trying to explain my thought processes and what the journey was like, was telling a story about the practice, but the actual thing that I was doing was trying to learn a speedrun, and that was enjoyable too for its own sake. I think the reason that speedrunning history videos took off in the way that they did was because there's a real pressure differential between the passions communities have for speedrunning and the relative lack of understanding from the general public. Many people know about Super Mario 64, yet before people like Summoning Salt started making documentaries about speedrunning, not as many people knew about the insane things that people were doing within the game outside of the community and the people that were doing it. This is an interesting story, familiar or somewhat familiar thing, and extreme passion creating an incredibly uncommon experience. And telling stories which appeal to people on a human level are how interest in an activity grows and spreads. So to that end, I'm quite thankful to all the speedrunning storytellers who have come before me. On a human level, speedrunning was obviously really appealing to me. I remember watching a video of Linkus7's Wind Waker HD 100% run where he set a world record by like 20 minutes over a 5-hour run. As he finished the final boss and crossed the threshold into an amazing world record, you could see his face on his tiny little face cam window on that video recording. He was shaking and nearly sobbing as the tension and nerves released and the waves of emotion flooded in. Clearly, on a personal level, this was an incredible accomplishment and relief and just an onslaught of raw emotion. In most cultures, we praise and celebrate achievement in sport as a sort of proxy for the virtues of practice and discipline and physiological prowess. To some extent, games of the mind like chess have a similar level of prestige, if not the same widespread interest as more mainline sports. Video gaming, I think, has really started to come into its own as a realm of serious play with a following outside of the communities that engage in the activity itself. Esports, speedrunning, long-form content about video games, games criticism, all of these things are subcultures spun out of the culture and artistic production of video games themselves. With nearly 50 years of history, video games themselves can hardly be thought of as a niche activity any longer. Though it's far from a mainstream way of engaging with video games, speedrunning is far from an obscure way of playing games at this point. I can hardly imagine it declining in the short to medium term. Like sports or other forms of play, I think speedrunning is a wonderful expression of play itself, which is a normative and healthy function of any society. Just like the production, discussion, and appreciation of art can form and foster communities, video gaming creates eddies and whirlpools in its wake of people who come together to enjoy something in a new way. One reason I find video gaming so enjoyable is that video games are a sort of playground of the mind which offer what few other media can in the same way. Great literature or movies offer our minds wonderful avenues to speculate, discuss, and analyze. Sports offer an unexpected outcome based on our own skill, coordination, and the team dynamics. Video gaming is something of a cross between these two things, and depending on the game, you can mix in the joy of just walking around and looking at stuff. As a writer, filmmaker, and storyteller, video games offer ample food for thought and discussion, especially when the extra fold of communities and the people that engage with video games are folded in. And so far, I've loved telling the stories about the communities that engage with games in unexpected ways. As we discussed earlier, speedrunning is a cultural activity that doesn't exist apart from the people participating in it. Yet, as a storyteller, I realized after finishing the Any% doc that while I had worked my hardest to represent the thoughts, reflections, and experiences of the people that made all this history, I had very little first-hand knowledge of the thing, speedrunning itself. By learning the route and trying to work on a speedrun myself, I found a novel pleasure of learning by first-hand experience the things that runners had told me throughout the documentary. I felt some satisfaction in knowing that even as I wrote about those things from an outsider's perspective, or made editorial decisions about what to include from an interview, I had actually gleaned many of the most important aspects of what it means to people to speedrun, or at the very least, what it means to speedrun Metroid Prime. The reason that I worked on a video like the one that you're watching or listening to now is because I thought that the process of telling a story about learning a speed game was important, and it wasn't really something that came through in the Any% documentary. I obviously thought that Metroid Prime was interesting enough to talk about for 6 hours, but somehow I felt like I could add some value to the discussion as a storyteller by putting in the practice and work to learn it for myself, and then to relay something of that experience to you, dear viewer, or listener. Again, if you're podcasting, that's fine. I see you, or, I'm acknowledging you right now. Anyway, now, I haven't been an active part of the Prime speedrunning community since the beginning, or even more than about 1/10 of the time that it's been around, because, again, I was working on that Any% video pretty long. I haven't played the game seriously since shortly after its release, and then when I started the project. Even now, 3 weeks into working on a run, I don't claim to have put the cap of a speedrunner on with all the experience that goes with it. Still, just like video games themselves are a fun narrative and experiential playground to unwind the mind and enjoy in your free time, so too had the experience of learning to speedrun and trying to convey these experiences in this video they've been something like a narrative playground for me. If you've hung around with me in this video so far, first of all, thank you for sticking around. I would love to hear in the comments section below about what your experience have been like playing Prime or other speed games. How has running the game changed your thoughts on it, your appreciation for it, your reflections on the community or other communities, and so on? Again, I read every single one of your comments, and especially for the people that I had never seen or heard from before who just talked about how much Metroid Prime meant to you. Those are some really awesome things to see and read about. So if you've tried speedrunning, because you watched the any percent video, please let me know your experiences and your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. So after shifting to the 104 route, I decided to jump into a full game run as soon as possible with one important addition: more expansions. Enemies were one of the hardest things to prepare for in a run. At this point, nothing in the game really posed any challenge to me if I was playing carefully and slowly, but when you make it your business to move through the game as quickly as possible, which usually involves trying to avoid confronting the enemies, suddenly you're taking a lot of damage. All this gave me a lot more appreciation for how the game is paced in terms of where the health refills are placed and how many energy tanks you have access to and how much damage different things do. I felt that trying to play quickly had made me basically as prone to damage as someone playing with limited knowledge of the game, and I found myself regularly having to be extra careful when I got into certain areas of the run. This is foreshadowing, by the way. Early on, Vertigo suggested that I stock up on energy tanks in order to get a run finished. I played too big for my britches and I lost a handful of runs to death, which might have been avoided with an extra energy tank or two. So now that I had a route that I knew I could take through to the end, I decided to increase my likelihood of success with some extra health margins. The two easiest energy tanks to add into the run order, especially early on, were Furnace and the energy tank behind the Hive mecha fight. The Furnace tank also gave some extra margin for early wild, which was much appreciated. With 2 extra tanks for the majority of the run, everything surprisingly, or actually not really surprisingly, got a lot easier, and I was able to get a lot farther into the run than before. The first diversion from my previous routes came when I turned left out of the Ice Beam door to head down into the outer edge of Talon Overworld to tee up Bar Skip. Bar Skip has a much different vibe than early wild. It's discouraging to miss it over and over again, but I consoled myself with the knowledge that even if it took 2 to 3 minutes or more, I did always eventually get it. This time was no different. I finally wiggled Samus through the gap, and with that I was off to Phazon Mines, and abruptly it felt like a whole different run. As soon as I got into Phazon Mines, I realized how unprepared I was for what was basically the back half of the run. I had practiced a few important tricks, but I had no real muscle memory or kind of overall grand vision of how to move through the majority of the rooms quickly in Phazon Mines. The first place that I really got smacked around by this was Main Quarry, the first large room of Phazon Mines. Again, because I had watched a ton of run footage, many of the runners made it look effortless to quickly jump to the left and save a huge chunk of time platforming around the far side of the room. However, I didn't know how to properly do this at all, and after trying and failing several times, I realized I just had to suck it up and go the long way around the room 3 times, because I also didn't really know how to do the dash to get to the waste disposal door, but again, this one's pretty easy. It just took me a couple tries to figure it out. I finally got there and I got down to fight the drone for main power bomb and got back out. I didn't know the climb up the crashed frigate and I didn't want to try to learn it on site. I didn't think that'd be a fruitful use of time. So instead I took a long trip through Chozo ruins again. I fought the Chozo ghosts needlessly, forgetting that they don't need to be dead in order to get the artifact of world. I made it back down to Great Tree Hall, only to realize that I never learned the spider skip for this room. And the recording here, if I were to show that, contains several pauses when I looked at Metroid 2002 in the middle of a speedrun and had to learn the trick on site, which took about an extra 5 minutes. I did eventually get it, and then I went and got X-Ray and the artifact of Chozo, and then back out into Phazon Mines. Phazon Mines 2 started horribly and eventually ended horribly in death. On my way to get Warrior, I got caught among some space pirates who absolutely ravaged my health, and I used my last powerbomb to escape. I got into Elite Research, and even after dispatching of everything in the room and destroying every crate, I had no powerbomb drops and about 25 health left. At this point, I just considered exit gaming myself, actually literally this point. But I decided to press on, and I timidly tiptoed out of the room and fought the space pirates in the previous room. I eventually got my bomb and I walked back with great fear and, just very careful shots to the space pirates in the bottom of the room in the elite enclosure. I figured as soon as I started that fight, I'd get smacked around and that would be the end of this run. However, I did manage to get through this fight and the rest of war processing, again, very slowly and painfully, and all the way down to Central Dynamo with about anywhere from 25 to 60 health. My heart was racing and I finally hobbled into the save station. I was just waiting at this point for the hilarious and horrible death of one of the ice pirate shots chasing me into the save station. But that didn't happen, and I was able to save and continue with full health to Metroid Quarantine A. Long story short, I died in Metroid Quarantine A. I was half relieved to let the run end though. I had played so poorly that I had little desire to showcase this run in any way. I told Vertigo about my run up to that point, including the time, which was 1:22 at the pre-Metroid Quarantine A save. He encouraged me that next run would be the one and gave me some suggestions on Frigate Climb and also the suggestion to add in the grapple beam. The grapple beam wasn't technically free in an absolute sense. I would need to go slightly off the normal path to grab it, and it would add maybe at most 20 or 30 seconds, but it would make the rest of the game significantly easier. This is an interesting point to go into this kind of tension between when you're trying to push the outer envelope of play. What strategies are you going to use? Justin has a great video called Quick Prime, the concept of urgency, in which he discusses the interplay between strategy, urgency, and consistency in getting a lower time. Strategy informs how urgent you can be in your movements. Your urgency is only as beneficial as what you can reliably execute, and if you can't reliably execute, you need to pick a different strategy. Yet, this is balanced against another Justinism: play for the time you want, not the time you have. In other words, there's not much point in playing to be the most conservative, unfailing level that you can play at and not try to go faster than that. Speedrunning is about finding the right edge to walk on as you push your time lower, but can still get reasonably consistent enough results in order to stay sane. Putting this into the quadrilateral of tricks that I gave, it's really the question of how many tricks from category A and B you're willing to mix into a run. If you don't do any of those tricks, it's unlikely that you'd make many, if any, mistakes. But then again, your time probably wouldn't be very good if, again, you literally just kind of like walk from point A to point B. If I tried every trick under the sun, which speedrunners have used to save a few seconds here and there, and I failed many of them or, took a long time to set them up, that would end up ending a good amount of time on its own, even if I did eventually get them. Putting this in the context of the run, skipping grapple beam could be thought of as a category A trick. The skipping is the category A trick, because not diverting off the route to grab it does save time, and many of the room strategies that avoid using it are faster. But if I failed those strategies and had to try 2 or 3 times, then any benefit of not diverting off the route is quickly erased. That said, there were still a few tricks I wanted to try just because they were fun. So I decided to mix some of those into my next route. Before we get to any discussion of the next attempt, I want to talk a bit about the stories that are still left to tell in Metroid Prime. First off, since you've made it this far into the video, I'll give you some more details on my next project, which will be released within the next few weeks. I'm going to be taking a systematic look at every room in Metroid Prime, starting with the Squiggly Boys, the least interesting rooms in the whole game. I figured that this would be a good place to start, as we'll try to get the least interesting rooms out of the way first. As I thought about what value I can add to the discourse of discussion around Metroid Prime, I figured that a keen observation of the rooms themselves, as well as some sort of compendium of the things that people have found interesting about them over the years, would be a good approach. My background is in fine art photography, so I'm used to the process of carefully observing the visual characteristics of a thing and then making inferences about its meaning. And of course, because I'm an artist, I can talk about that for a while. Like I talked about in the Any% doc, I think that Metroid Prime might have been one of the first places I really started to do this as a kid. As I looked around the worlds and the care and attention given to every little detail, my mind could only wander thinking of all the possible stories and potential meanings behind every little detail. Well-made art, good video games, good movies, good books, whatever, they all open new horizons of possibilities for discussion and community. So I think trying to critique or at least kind of catalog the totality of a thing like Metroid Prime is a worthwhile pursuit. Each room is unique, well, except for some of the Squiggly Boys, but there's still some minor variations, and we'll get into that. When open world games balloon in size, there's always some continuum of compromise between procedurally generated content or cookie cutter content to make the scope of work reasonable, and the more handcrafted small scale content mixed in. I love the open world of the Fallout games for various reasons, but many of the spaces of the game, especially the interior ones, but also the exterior ones to some extent, they kind of start to run together a little bit. The experience of the totality of the thing is still interesting in terms of environmental storytelling, but you're not going to go into any given house and look closely at it for a rich cause for speculation, you know. Obviously, it's kind of fun to see like a skeleton on a bed, but you know, when you see that 6 or 7 times, you just, each one sort of loses its pizzazz. But Metroid Prime exists in a really nice Goldilocks zone in which the world is big enough to feel expansive and complex, yet it's small enough to also have each room handcrafted and worked on in some way. In any case, that's what's on the deck next in terms of Metroid Prime content. What else beyond that, though, is there still to say about this game? This is something that I'm wrestling with to some extent. I don't only want to make videos about Metroid Prime, or again, video games generally, but there's still a lot of depth to this game and its community that I feel like I haven't conveyed yet. The Any% documentary was motivated by 2 basic questions. Why had a community been so invested in this game for so many years, and why had it not exploded in popularity along the broader explosion in popularity for speedrunning in the early 2010s? I think that I gave good intellectual answers to those questions in the documentary, but as I learned this simple Any% route, I really learned the intuitive answers to those questions and what those answers meant to the people that know the game much better than I do. I enjoyed learning the route and the tricks and practicing everything that went with it. It was a unique and enjoyable satisfaction that I hadn't really experienced before, even in a high skill threshold game. Yet, having learned those things, I realized that so many of the things about the game that just completely flew by me when I was making the documentary. A lot of things that I still had questions to as I was wrapping up the Any% doc were answered in bits and pieces as I learned the route and some of the tricks for myself. But the answers weren't really interesting unless you were trying to speedrun the game. One example I'll give is the instant unmorph coming out of the magma pool IS that some of the later Any% runs by Justin used. I never really understood why Justin could unmorph in that spot without triggering light show and what it accomplished. Yet after I spent a bit more time learning the inbounds wave sun trick and then studying Justin's beginner route tutorial, first of all, he did give an answer to this question in that video, so again, that's another plug for that video, it's great. But again, kind of more broadly and more conceptually, I realized that unmorphing fixes part of IS and that boosting makes Samus touch nearly everything part. That's what's fixed by unmorphing in a place where there's a camera hint. It's kind of a tricky, definition that is a bit hard to explain. And all of this allows, obviously, for faster transit to the save station. Now, again, this is satisfying to have an answer for, of course, at least it's personally satisfying to me. But I think that the rabbit trails of trying to explain every little thing that I could grab an answer to is what made the video so long. Some of the length was fun diversions and other aspects of the story that I found interesting, but I will definitely admit that there was a lot of bloat in certain parts that could have been trimmed down or more focused. Again, I made the video I wanted to make. I made the video that was enjoyable to me, that kind of spurred me on. I'm not going to apologize for its length or anything like that, but I get it. I'm not going to be making a 6-hour, epic probably ever again. We're gonna change some things up the next time we do anything like that, if it happens. So again, I'm not apologizing for it, and I think that's part of what gave the video its charm. The script was a journey of discovery for me as I learned about the game and its history. Kind of like this video has been, and this script are a journey of discovery for me learning how to run the game. At a certain point, there's a level of knowledge, both conceptual and practical, that there's no reason to gain unless you're trying to speedrun the game yourself. Part of the skill of a storyteller, which I'm still trying to understand and grow better at, is to separate the wheat and the weeds of how much and what kind of information is interesting for people who aren't me. So, with all that said, one of the things that I teased in the Any% doc was a low percent history. I'm still very much on the fence about this video, and I think that there are only a few things which would put me way over the top about making me excited to do it. First would be if 20% for human execution were solved, which would be a huge milestone and worthy of some attention and celebration via a long video about the progression to that point. Second would be if I could line up a number of interviews with a variety of people who are directly involved with bringing the percentage down. The latter seems more likely, and this would probably be just kind of, again, a re-examination or a deeper look into the broader community using the low percent category progression as sort of a thread to tie it all together. The reason that a low percent video scares me is that there are vast oceans of discussion and extremely tiny details of the things that needed to be discovered in order to solve low percent at various stages. Apart from some really compelling human narratives, I'm not confident in my narrative abilities to make the pure detailing and cataloging and discussion of the progression of certain tricks interesting enough to carry the length of any such video, no matter how long it might be. I can't rehash all of the details of movement in Metroid Prime and the genesis of Metroid 2002 again, so the structure of this video would need to be significantly different in some way, and so far I don't really have a compelling vision for what that could be. Still, there are things in Metroid Prime which seem so impressive to me that I can hardly help but want to craft them into a narrative video of some form. Vertigo sent me an amazing video of out-of-bounds movement through Magmore Caverns with 5 energy tanks but without Varia Suit, Morph Ball Bombs, or Space Jump. He told me about a run through the game which he achieved using every item collected except Space Jump and Morph Ball Bombs, 2 of the most important items for movement in and out of bounds. The fact that he was able to achieve this run over 4 months of work and 32 segments and 6 hours of in-game time, it's astounding. There are a lot of ways to convey how astounding this is, but now that I've learned this any % route, it's hard for me to imagine that I can explain how amazing it is properly. In other words, to have spent some time realizing how hard the game actually is and then to reflect in amazement on Vertigo's accomplishment, I'm just not sure that I can add to that experience, that amazement, without just going minute by minute in his run and saying, this is very, very hard, over and over again, every time he does something hard, which is pretty much every moment in the run. Ultimately, what makes a story interesting is to be able to tell it on a human level. People know how hard it is to throw a football, kick a soccer ball, run fast, hit a golf ball, etc. We can intuit physical accomplishment, but it's hard to contextualize accomplishment in video games. It's an interesting storytelling challenge, and of course, Metroid Prime seems to be a game for people who love interesting challenges. The next evening, I sat down with the confidence Vertigo had given me to complete this run. This was going to be the run. I didn't try to add too many new tricks to the route at this point. I just quickly learned the things that I needed to do. Vertigo sent me a video of a very achievable and simple frigate climb and suggested that I get the grapple beam. And so I added these things to the run and continued on my way without too much doubt that I was going to get it on this attempt. The reason I felt confident was that nothing in the run felt especially scary or incredibly unknown anymore. Everything after Metroid Quarantine A was fairly unknown to me, at least in the sense of completing it in a run, but I had practiced Ridley, I'd practiced Omega Pirate, and I knew how to beat Metroid Prime. Even if the rest of the rooms were slow, they would eventually get done. The margin of extra energy tanks and missiles gave me plenty of room to breathe, and it felt possible. The beginning of the run had become a very familiar ritual at this point, as I, took my turns through the frigate. The frigate escape had become a nice little micro speed run, which was enjoyable to try to push lower and lower, or I guess higher and higher since the time counted backwards. In running Metroid Prime, especially in the early sections of the run, it was a nice balance between familiarity, focus, and rest. Some sections of the run at this point had become almost automatic, like rolling Samus through the ruined fountain access. But somehow the act of trying to optimize even this tiny section of gameplay was still very engaging. Some sections still took a significant amount of focus, even if the stakes weren't seriously high, like the sequence to get out of the outside of the monitor station or the jump up to nature. However, there were also those brief shots of adrenaline for stuff like Flagra, the Genius strats, which I had lost 2 runs to at various points. There was also Early Wild, which we've talked about multiple points throughout this video. And when I did eventually get to Metroid Quarantine A, this was another nail biter. I worked up a sweat of frustration and concentration as I worked my way through bar skip. These are some of the more intense portions of the run, which took my active focus and every little bit of attention that I could muster. Yet, there were also many legitimately relaxing portions of the run. There's something so nice about the built-in breaks of the elevator world transitions, long boss cutscenes, and the like, which just allows you to put the controller down for a second, maybe respond to a quick message, put some new music on, and just catch your breath mentally and refocus for the next section. However, after Metroid Quarantine A, that focus really deteriorated. I had never really played the full sequence of Metroid Quarantine A to Omega, back to Newborn, and out of Phazon Mines. I used a lot of save stations on my second Mines trip, and not just to save and kind of roll back to if I lost the run, but I also just needed the health. I did a lot of silly things too. I fell off of the platform above the Omega Pirate Arena after collecting Newborn, and in that moment I felt so silly and ashamed that I wanted to reset and throw away 2 hours of work in a nearly guaranteed time, but I pressed on. A little bit earlier during Omega Pirate, I started to get a bit low on health. I remember my only real thought being, I can't believe I was thinking of doing this run with only 3 energy tanks. If I was on tight margins with 5 tanks that I had at the time, the thought of coming back through with 2 tanks less margin seemed rather absurd to me at that point. Playing while low on health really focused everything that I was doing, and it probably slowed me down a bit, but I was able to get through nonetheless. I wasn't really thinking of losing the run, I was just letting the annoyance and the focus guide my play on a second-by-second basis. I missed the single cycle Omega Pirate fight, and I gulped thinking of the additional round of pirates that were dropping. However, I was able to squeak out the rest of the fight without dying. Thank goodness. I backed out of the arena and I gave myself another safety save. I wasn't really planning on taking the run the rest of the way if I failed, but I also just wanted to know what my time was at that point if I died. Seeing a 1 in front of my time at the later stages of the game had been fairly encouraging thus far, so I allowed myself a save just to see what the time would be in case the worst happened. The additional defense that the Phazon suit provided, along with the extra energy tank after Omega, made me feel fairly unkillable. I went to do the penultimate turn through Phendrana Drifts to get Thermal, Elder, and Spirit, and another energy tank for good measure. I made some really gross blunders, like falling multiple times trying to get Spirit, even though I had the grapple beam. I was considering doing the non-grapple method, which I do know, but I figured it would probably be easier to do it the proper way. This is debatable. I wasn't sure which would have been more humiliating to share, falling even once at the sequence break method when I did have everything that I needed for the non-sequence break method, or failing at normal gameplay while trying to get up that room. What I know was deeply humiliating was what happened to me in Frozen Pike. 3 deeply demoralizing drops to the bottom of that icy lake. These each raised the humiliation exponentially, as they were just drops during vanilla gameplay, not even trying to do anything slick. As I slogged through the water, I thought about how relatively simple the run had been up to this point, and how it would be easy to just hit that reset button and try again. But considering that truly the only difficult things left to do were Ridley and Prime, I buried my ego a bit deeper and continued on. I'm not sure how much mental fatigue contributed to these mistakes. I'd been playing for about 2 hours at this point, and while I felt focused enough, it just seems obvious in retrospect that these were very trivial mistakes. I felt physically tired, and this was because I was working on the run somewhat late in the evening. I had to pee, I was getting kind of hungry. Anyway, yeah, I just wasn't playing very focused, and I think it shows. To my chagrin, I was also running low on recorder space. I started with a little over 2 hours of disk space left, which I figured was more than enough, but it wasn't. During the cutscenes, I booted up OBS to create a backup recording. Oh well, just another strike against this very bizarre and unpolished run. As I was wrapping up this run, I thought about how badly I wanted a lower time. Even before the run was finished, I felt on a very visceral level the thing that I had seen runners write so many times. Calfolio, Kip, Claris, and Justin, just from memory. This run sucks, still a lot of time to come off. Considering that I had set no personal best, I was guaranteed to beat my own non-existent time. So I pushed forward, hoping to at least beat 2 hours IGT. Calfolio's 146 felt pretty well off the table, but I thought sub 2 might still be in play. Ridley and Metroid Prime went poorly, but never felt too scary. Phazon core platforming up to Metroid Prime just felt very bad. At that point, I felt like my nerves were so far from focus that I just tried to get out the room like any normal player might, with the possible exception of not stopping to kill the Metroids. I even stopped in the missile station as a send-up to Calfolio. As soon as the fight with Prime started, I felt very stupid as I realized that I had no use for those missiles, since I didn't have super missiles or the ice spreader, or the wave buster for that matter. I kind of hope this script is getting close to the word count needed to fill up the duration of the run. I promised that I didn't try to pad out the script with anything necessary, at least at first, but looking at where my time is on Audition, I will probably have to write a few more things if I want to fill up the whole video. Anyway. Sorry, this one, script-wise, might actually have just a little bit of bloat in it. After I finally got through the Exo fight, Essence also went pretty badly. Once I realized that if I stood on that famous little branch where Essence's attacks don't hit you, there wasn't really much it could do to me. I felt safe. However, not knowing any of the dynamics of the fight or how to properly do pool canceling, I was a bit lost. I just stood around with no real fear of dying and just thinking about how long this blasted fight was taking. Just for the record, I didn't practice Impact Crater, Exo, or Essence at any point in my practice, So if these fights look like a minimally experienced player giving it their best go, that's because that's what you're watching. Once Essence was down and the run was over, I started shivering a bit as it had become quite cold in my basement office in January. I didn't feel any profound wave of relief or accomplishment. It really just felt like the natural conclusion of having practiced and familiarized myself over the course of 3 weeks and many hours of gameplay. I didn't feel like I was owed the outcome or anything like that, but like I said, I understood on a very visceral level what everyone had said about reaching the conclusion of a run and saying, man, I know there's a lot of time to come off that run, because there was a lot of time to come off. I had made a huge amount of mistakes. I sent some Discord messages to the gang and chilled while the credits rolled. This may sound ridiculous, but I figure I might as well share all my random little thoughts for whatever they're worth. Even the credits have a nice cadence to them in a Metroid Prime speedrun, since the IGT displayed at the end of the credits is the thing that the players are trying to optimize. Spending time just hanging out and waiting for that to end is a nice way to unwind the nerves. You might look at your phone or a browser or something, but you can't really stop the recording or turn the game off. You just have to let it do its thing and wait for a bit and reflect on all the people that made this game. My time was a 2:03, which was, of course, rather disappointing. Still, the community was encouraging and excited to see my time. My name got turned purple on the Prime Speedrunning Discord, denoting a speedrunner. And I felt warm and grateful for the little gesture. It really was a nice throwback to the early days of the internet when communities were smaller and sort of self-sorted around interests, and you had experience with nearly every person in the community to some extent. And these little minutiae of user categories, little bits of swag, and everything else that got glommed onto your profile, it felt significant and nice and familiar. It was nice. And I'm nostalgia rambling again, sorry. So that was my first single segment any percent time in the quest to get it. I reached my goal of finishing, even if I didn't reach my goal time of 1:46, as I was hoping to at least beat Calfulio's first recorded world record. The biggest feeling that accompanies having finished the run is just a feeling like it's possible to do better. Again, this is one of those things that I saw again and again from the runners that I've now independently verified from my own personal feelings. Coming off of a run, it is so easy to laser focus on all of your mistakes and remember all the frustrating moments where things didn't quite pan out quite as you'd expected, and you just feel it so tangibly at the end of the run. Still a lot to come off. That phrase that I saw over and over again, still a lot to come off. One of the questions that I asked almost everyone I interviewed was, what makes Metroid Prime unique as a speedrunning game? Having not made the effort to speedrun other games, I can't really answer that question comparatively, but having worked through many of the mechanics and techniques necessary for speedrunning Prime, I think there are a few significant things which make it quite interesting as a speedrun game. First of all, one of the things that I think make Metroid Prime unique is the unlimited threshold of movement possibility across a wide variety of rooms. This might just turn into me saying the run is very, very hard over and over again, like I was talking about in reference to low percent. But there really is something interesting about the rooms of Metroid Prime which create a unique and tremendously engaging challenge to speedrun the game. I'll give you one example. I was watching Justin's any percent beginner route tutorial, and towards the end of the run he passes through Crater Tunnel A, the first room besides the elevator room in the Impact Crater, the last world of the game. It's one of the squiggly boys I'll be talking about in the next video. It's not an especially interesting room. He doesn't talk about strategy or the technique he uses to get through it at all, but just says, make your way through this room. However, when he says that, he uses a damage boost R jump bunny hop off of the Lumigex, and this is the only room in the entire game where these show up, and this propels Samus across the second half of the room and puts her right at the door. This may only save like a second or maybe 2 seconds at most, and it may or may not be hard. I don't know how to do it. But Justin just does it instinctually and doesn't go into any detail about how to do it because he's fast. This particular strategy didn't rise to my attention in the any percent doc process. It's definitely not something I would specifically practice and attempt early on when trying to get my time lower. This is definitely a category A trick, just something to sprinkle in to shave off time. It's not something that Justin felt the need to remark on or teach when going through the basics of the any percent route, but it certainly saves just a tiny fraction of time. Since every room is unique, it's not like you're going to be able to apply that principle in every Lumigex crater room that you're going to encounter. It's just that one room. Yet, every room has its unique quirks and oddities and things that you can find to improve them each time you run the game. There's so much depth to explore and so many different mechanics that you can use to try to achieve faster movement through the game. but that doesn't even consider the issue of route. Secondly, one of the things that I think make Metroid Prime interesting to speedrun is that routing of the game has the same questions of improvability and potential on a macro level. Due to the spaghetti bowl nature of the route in Metroid Prime, there are a vast number of ways to achieve the various goals that a runner might set out with at the beginning of the game. True, the most optimal routes, given different levels of skill and varying confidence levels with different tricks, are basically solved. Yet the most optimal says nothing about what a runner might actually be able to do with such a set of tools, or what they might be interested in running the game with. I talked about this earlier, but there's such an interesting interplay between runner skill and the feasibility of various routes and strategies. Based on my level of skill, it would probably make more sense to fight Thardus and just get Spiderball, just like it made more sense to do the slight deviation to get Grapple Beam. Timing this becomes an interesting dance between measuring your current level of skill against the time-saving possibilities of executing a simpler strategy without any flubs or hesitation. Even when your level of skill approaches the point of the fastest runners in the world, there's still huge air pockets of time to be saved in various rooms. Just like computers have vastly eclipsed the highest possible threshold of human play in chess, so too do task strategies give us a peek into the reality of how much faster Metroid Prime could be with perfect play, even along the same route. This route, trick, skill balance is, I think, especially interesting for a new runner. It might make sense just to do the simplest route first in order to get a time on the board. But once that's in hand, suddenly the possibilities of the game open up as you consider either improving on the route that you already used, or trying to learn a new trick to open up a whole new set of possibilities. And finally, various run categories have a massive effect on the character of the run. Any percent is the simplest guiding principle for optimization. You get whatever you need to get, or skip whatever you can skip in order to achieve the lowest possible time. But there are a huge number of possible ways of playing the game which completely change the characteristics of routing. Even after weeks of putting in the work for any percent, I realized at one point that I had little to no insight on what a 100% run would look like or how to achieve it. Still, the thought of running another category became quite interesting to me. I guess any speed game has some shade of this distinction for the various categories, but somehow each of the previous points builds on each other and make various route categories, or percentage categories rather, even more fascinating. Because again, you're going to be interacting with the same room, but now you're approaching them with different objectives in mind, or a different set of expansions which add a new layer of possibilities. You're going to see more parts of the game, and so there's more to learn and optimize. And this doesn't even touch the other end of the spectrum, low percent. If adding more items makes the run more interesting and adds new objectives, low percent reduces the number of objectives, but makes them vastly more challenging. Low percent is for the true student of Metroid Prime. The people that not only want to learn the things that are fast, but also peel back all the esoteric levels of knowledge of the game in order to learn how to exploit every little quirk of the physics and level design to steer Samus where she otherwise would be completely unable to go. So, Metroid Prime is an interesting game to speedrun. On the micro level, the movement mechanics and the quirks and peculiarities of each room mean that there's always something to practice or optimize or improve on. The characteristics and possibilities of the run, as well as the sort of challenges you'll face, they change each time you're going to make a change in the route. And finally, all of this gets jumbled up completely if you're trying to complete a speedrun in any of the other categories. That's my pitch to try running Metroid Prime if you've never done it before. As I wind down this video, let me address a few different audiences that might be listening. And if you're still listening, thank you. I've seen the watch time statistics for the 80% history video, so I know that viewership tends to drop off pretty drastically over the length of a whole video, especially one this long, so thanks for sticking around. First, if you've never played Metroid Prime but you're interested in trying it, I highly recommend it. Again, I'll plug the Metroid Prime speedrunning Discord, Justin's 80% tutorial, the practice mod, running the game on Dolphin. The community has some amazing resources for giving this game a try for the first time. If you want to start playing the game and speedrunning Metroid Prime, I would recommend Justin's IS beginner route as the best path forward. I would also recommend playing the game through casually one time in order to get a general feel for the layout of the world, the things you need to get to finish the game, and how to move Samus in the game. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time talking about how interesting and well made the game is, so I think you owe it to yourself to at least experience it without trying to speedrun it for the first time. Finally, if you've become interested in running the game as a result of watching any of my videos, please let me know. I would love to hear what made you want to try it, what your experiences were playing it for the first time, and any thoughts you might have. Leave a comment below or ping me on the Metroid Prime speedrunning Discord. I'd love to hear from you. Second, if you're a seasoned runner of Metroid Prime, I'd also love to hear from you. I've chatted with many of you at various points, but if you were featured in the any percent doc or ever held a record in any of the categories of Metroid Prime, were a longtime speedrunner and member of the Prime community, or helped to develop the game, or just have some interesting connection to the game and its community, I'd love to hear from you. There's an email address on my page that you can use to reach out to me. I'd also love to chat and hear your thoughts on the history video or the game or whatever else you want to talk about. I don't know, talk about the weather, talk about commodities prices, I don't know. And if I really did miss the mark conceptually on anything in this video or others, please let me know as well. This video was basically me monologuing about my own experiences, so I didn't really have any fact or vibe checking from Tom or anyone else on the Prime speedrunning Discord on this one. If I said something really dumb or unhelpful about how to practice or made something way harder than I needed it to be, I'd love to hear about that as well. Finally, if you are just enjoying my videos but don't really care about Metroid Prime, I saved the narrowest category for last. If you've subscribed to my channel and are enjoying the ride without any real interest in Metroid Prime, well, thanks for sticking around. I love to hear what you're enjoying about these videos. As I've said a couple of times, I don't want to only make Metroid Prime content, or only make content about video games for that matter. So if there's some aspect of what I'm making that you're really tracking with and it isn't tied to Metroid Prime or video games, I would love to hear what you're enjoying. And tell a friend, because it really does mean a lot and help out the channel when you share and tell people and spread the content around, so thank you in advance. It took me a few days to wrap up the script after getting that first any percent time. I wrote a little bit extra to get as close to the runtime of the whole thing as possible, but I suspect that I'm probably still going to be just a little bit short. And if I'm not short, it's probably because I went back into the video and tweaked some things here and there. I don't know, maybe I'll delete some cutscenes out of the run. Anyway, hopefully this is still more or less coherent. By way of epilogue to the epilogue, I guess, I'd like to talk a little bit about Justin's double IAS route and the joy of discovering something in Metroid Prime that was actually vastly easier than I was expecting. Infinite Speed after Sheegoth and in Magma Pool are both very easy tricks to learn and relatively straightforward to execute. They can be failed and softlock the game, but it's pretty easy to avoid this, and they provide dramatic benefits without real penalty for failure. Again, if you kind of put on your safety gear and remember to do a few simple things, IS will be fine. Justin's route also opts for a Thardus fight and a single trip mines, which was faster than any of the alternative routing options that I tried, including 2 trips options that I looked at various points. It was interesting as I considered Justin's beginner route and I fiddled with the alternatives. At first, I thought that perhaps using the bar skip to enter mines immediately after ice might be viable. I thought that maybe Justin had only kept bar skip out of the route to keep it more beginner friendly. But after talking about it on the Prime Discord, I realized, because people had timed it already and had shown me the proof, that plasma first and then a single trip mines was in fact the better option. In adopting someone else's route out of the box, I was starting to lose some of my learning through experience failures that I earned through a lot of work trying to figure out the route on my own. Still, I had a lot of fun trying to figure out that route on my own, and I think that I learned a lot. Again, I think it was really helpful kind of intellectually to go through the exercise of trying to come up with a route from scratch just based on the knowledge of the game that I already had. Kind of bumping into some of the issues that I was having and figuring things out on the fly was a really good way to learn and get familiar with the game. So I'm at a bit of an interesting crossroads at this exact moment as I type these words and I read them again on the voiceover. The script sits at about 18,600 words, and with my pace of speaking, that's probably between an hour and a half to 2 hours of speaking time. My footage for my first run sat at well over 2.5 hours. Again, it was not the fastest run. And I don't want to pad out the script any longer than it needs to be. Again, like I'm not trying to make a 6-hour video and certainly not a 6-hour speedrun. So instead of trying to make the script longer than it needed to be necessarily, I decided to see if I could make the footage a little bit shorter. I decided to jump in with Justin's double IS route, just give it a rip. I had practiced it a little bit, but not methodically and not every section. I just wanted to see what I could do stringing things together and what the new faster time I could possibly get would be. So I have to confess, this whole video has been a bit of a bait and switch. Again, the premise of this was that I was going to try to on-site an any percent single segment run and then post that wherever the chips may fall. But if you were paying attention to my description of Justin's IS route, you probably have realized that that is the footage that you've been watching. This whole video has been my first attempt at the double IS route after I had already gotten a single segment time. So here we are. The more I practiced Justin's double IS beginner route, the more I realized how vastly superior it was. It made a lot of things way easier. It straightened out a lot of the crooked backtracking I was using in the 104 route, and overall, it's just better. Just so you know that I'm not trying to save myself the embarrassment of posting a crummy run, I will post both my original 203 time as an unlisted video, as well as just letting this footage play, the actual first attempt at the double IS route. There are some pretty outrageous blunders in this run that are worth noting if you haven't noticed them already. And again, we're like long past them at this point, but if you want to go back and find them, if you've just been listening to this, I think they're worth a watch. I do hope you will at least get a kick out of the multiple failed attempts at getting the race tank in Magmore Caverns, which I actually tried again when I was coming back through that room, and again, failed twice. And so I just said, you know what? I'm not dying in the lava. I'm not losing another run to this stupid energy tank. I'm gonna keep going. So be it. I also fell multiple times on the way up Arboretum, and I wasn't even going for the faster strat. I was just trying to scan the rune points, and I was just failing miserably. And just for good measure, there was also another trip to the bottom of Frozen Pike, which again, if you'll remember earlier in my monologue, in the first route, I fell to the bottom of this room about 3 times. And just to round things out, my Metroid Prime fights were pretty sloppy, because again, I never practice Exo. And I never practiced Essence either, and Essence was terrifying because I got down to about 70 health, and I was really nervous about losing the run in the last boss, which would have been frustrating. I won't belabor the details of this run too much, but I'll say that this run definitely felt easier than the other route that I had tried to cobble together. Part of the reason that I decided to change the route to show underneath this video as I spoke is that I knew that there was an outside chance that this video might be the thing that someone sees, which causes them to consider whether or not they want to run Metroid Prime. I feel like I gave a pretty good amount of explanation as to why I chose to do my funky route at first, but the more I thought about how I wanted to close this video and how I wanted to tell them repeatedly just to try the route that Justin lays out, the more I thought about how much better it would actually be to just show off that route. And again, to start to wrap things up in this video again, I'll give just one piece of runner advice. And from here until I say end of heavily subjective opinion, this is all my heavily subjective opinion. It does not necessarily represent the opinion of Justin or anyone else on the Prime Speedrunning Discord. This is just what me, Nick at Day, an extreme speedrunning novice, would recommend to you. A totally inexperienced player of Prime, I'm assuming, if you do want to learn the game from nothing. First of all, as I said earlier, play the game normally and enjoy Metroid Prime as it was meant to be played at least once. I think I already might be getting into hot water with the Prime Speedrunning Discord by saying as it was meant to be played, but you know, as the developers sort of dreamed the average player would be playing it, I would recommend playing it that way at least once. If you enjoy it and you still want to speedrun it, I would recommend using the practice mod or save states to learn several vitally important tricks in the following order. Space jump first, because again, I think this is actually a pretty easy one to get. It helps you understand the extremely important mechanic of dashing, and it is just fun to get the space jump first in a playthrough. Then go on and practice early wild again and again and again and again. Use save states if you have to. This trick is so vitally important to get for speedrunning. And if you have the patience to learn this trick, you will definitely have the patience to learn the rest of the run. Then do the early sun infinite speed and the magma pool powerbomb infinite speeds, and also carry those through all the way to the elevator in the case of sun, or the save station in the case of magma pool. Just again, get those kind of reps of transiting Phendrana drifts or Chozo ruins respectively in that infinite speed state, because those are important. Learn the Twin Fires tunnel dash. That was another one that gave me a huge amount of trouble. As Justin mentions in the 100% tutorial, it can be a choke point for new runners. So really drill that one in and learn that one. Learn early plasma beam. That one has several tricky jumps and it can be a little bit discouraging to fall all the way to the bottom of that room a bunch. So practice that one a lot. Practice Metroid Quarantine B without the spider or grapple. And again, you will probably have spider ball in that point in the run, but it's good to just kind of practice that run, especially kind of deep in phase on mines. You might be low on health, and that's one where you can start to get a little bit frayed, especially before Omega Pirate. And then finally, I would say also practice the ore processing climb, because that's a bit of a weird room. Fortunately, that's just pure platforming, which is fairly easy to practice, but that's a nice one to get some confidence on and really get some reps in and feel like you really have it down pat. You can use Justin's tutorial or other tutorials to learn these tricks, but I would drill in several reps on these tricks. Again, get to the point where you're comfortable with them. Then I would recommend trying to play the game with save stations rather than save states, so that again, you get those extra little portions of gameplay on either end for as many times as you fail. And then just basically follow that route that Justin gives you and integrate all of these tricks. Try to move as quickly as possible through the game, but don't get too hung up on the right way of doing minor rooms. Keep tricks like Early Wild and Twin Fire Tunnels and other run-ending tricks in the context of the entire game, and just run it over and over again until you get the entire route finished. If you get lost or turned around, so be it. Just finish the run. Then, and only then, go back through and start studying Justin's beginner route tutorial section by section, and think about how you figured out to do certain rooms on your own and how Justin is doing them. You won't be able to hit or remember every dash and every little speed trick at first, but now you at least have something of your own muscle memory to build upon and tweak and adjust given this new information or refresher of information from Justin's tutorial. Hopefully you've also built up some muscle memory and skills for things like morph ball movement and dashing, so hopefully it should be a bit easier to learn new room strats going forward. All of this is to say, try to figure out a few things on your own before jumping to follow Justin's tutorial on a minute-by-minute basis. Throughout this process, I wasn't worried so much about learning bad habits as I was wasting time practicing the wrong things. I probably could have spent an entire month practicing spider lift shafts and gotten maybe somewhere close to the point where it could have been used in a run. However, if I had spent the entire month practicing that single trick, I wouldn't have gotten any of practice on the rest of the route, and I wouldn't be anywhere closer to a completed run. I wanted to get into full runs of the game as quickly as possible and try to figure out what rooms felt like on a first-hand basis as soon as I could. It's easy to study and listen to someone else who has a vast reservoir of experience built up around the game, but unless you actually work to put it into practice and use their knowledge to shape and form your own practice, you may either lose the forest for the trees of individual tricks or spend a lot of time practicing unhelpful things. Furthermore, I think a lot of the time that a new runner can shave off is just consistency and accuracy. My personal opinion, and again, we are still in personal opinion territory, is that getting overly fixated on hitting a very specific type of dash or a really fast room strat, or anything which only saves that marginal amount of time over something similar, these can really slow you down and detract from focus on the fundamentals and sort of the familiarization with the overall room itself. In the 148 run that you're seeing, oh, by the way, that was the time, 148. I think we might be getting close to the credits by now, maybe not, but it was a 148. I guess I probably put in the title. Anyway, there were tons of things that I tried because I thought they would be faster or cool, and I just failed. I guess one that comes to mind is
Ice Ruins West.
I tried to do that sweet little dash and the little ghetto jump over the wall that gets you to the door a lot faster, and in previous runs it took me many tries, but I did eventually get it. And in this run, I think I tried maybe 6 or 7 times, and then I was like, you know what? We're going around. I could have hit it on the next one, but we're going around because I'm tired of trying. And in all honesty, unless I could hit that trick, within 1 or 2 tries every time, it probably makes more sense just to spend the extra second or two to roll around the outside of that room. Like Justin says, sometimes you have to execute for the time that you want, not the time that you have. So I'll probably keep going for tricks like that. And this is a very subjective thing of deciding what tricks that you're comfortable with to actually try on a regular basis when you're going for a time. So that said, there were plenty of things that I knew were faster and I wasn't 100% confident on, but I went for it anyway. And it turned out fine. And it was faster. And those feel really good to hit. Like in Frozen Pike, I'd only practiced that little dash kind of to skip the morph ball tunnel maybe once or twice. And despite my history, which I'm rapidly developing with Frozen Pike, I went for it anyway. And you know what? I hit it first try and it felt awesome. So the more you play and practice, the more you get a bit of a touch of how to control Samus. and the more you get in touch with your own nerves and how you're playing and feeling and whether or not you actually want to try something. So this is the end of the very subjective personal opinion section. But you know, now that I think about it, it's not like everything else in this video isn't a personal opinion or my own reflection. I just want to underscore in that section specifically that others may and likely do disagree with me on these points, and so be it. You are, of course, more than welcome to boot up Justin's tutorial with no knowledge of the game whatsoever and just wail on it. I'm sure you'll get some value of trying to follow it beat by beat. If you'd rather try that, I would love to listen to your video essay about learning to speedrun Metroid Prime. I actually would. Again, I think it would be cool to kind of hear someone's take on taking a completely different approach to learning this game, so you, of course, are more than welcome to try that. I'll say in closing as it pertains to this route, one really nice thing about the double IAS beginner route is that it's pretty customizable. There are a ton of different energy tanks and missile expansions that I picked up in this run that can be dropped at various points, again, as I get more comfortable and willing to sort of run with less health. If I ever decide to really grind and learn spider lift shafts, I can just drop Spider Ball and then do Spider Lift shafts, and that's kind of the main thing that was really keeping Spider Ball in the run is, of course, the transit of those rascally shafts and Phazon mines. So the original 104 route, the one that Kip and MP Zoid used, that route had a few one-try tricks, you know, things that will kill the run if you fail them. But the double IS route has a lot of forgiving tricks. You know, there's a lot of things that you can do in a more comfortable way, and they won't necessarily kill a run if you mess them up. So that's very nice as well. I hope that's helpful and encouraging if you're interested in speedrunning this game. Again, it's not like impossibly difficult to speedrun, it's just a little weird. The tank controls do get some getting used to, sure, but as far as this route goes, there are a lot of ways to tweak it in order to make it a bit more manageable and less daunting. So once and for all, this is the actual ending. Thank you for hanging out and listening to my random thoughts about Metroid Prime and speedrunning. As I've mentioned before, I got some new videos coming out soon, looking at the individual rooms of Metroid Prime. If you're still listening or watching at this point and you've not subscribed, go ahead and do the stuff. It's deeply appreciated and helps out tremendously, especially in these tender early days when I've still got under 1,000 subs on this channel and I'm still trying to figure out if YouTube is a viable side project or not. Every bit of encouragement and feedback and help is greatly appreciated, so thank you very much. I want to give a few shout outs and thank yous as well. Thank you to Fusion Varia and Vertigo, who helped out a lot with encouragement and pointers in my kind of first couple weeks of figuring out my own route and just figuring out what the game was like. Thank you to Tom, as always, for your friendship and support. Thank you for doing the audio engineering on this, so if it sounds good, it is all credit to Tom, and if it sounds bad, it's my fault. Thank you to Justin for the amazing beginner route tutorial. It is truly a phenomenal resource for new runners, and that's really the video that you should be studying and listening to if you want to learn the game in earnest. Thank you again to my wife for your patience and the evenings you gave up so that I could work on running the game. Thanks to the Prime Speedrunning Discord and everyone who's gathered together, the tremendous armada of videos and resources on learning different tricks. It is amazing how many ways there are to play this game. Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to you, dear viewer. Thanks for hanging out.